So we're now going to look at the cosmogony, that is the creation myth as found in the Indo-European myths. And we will see what a scholar called Bruce Lincoln has said about his reconstructed cosmogony, and then we will look at my interpretation to see if there's any other possible explanation. Now, I'll start off with the Germanic creation myth, which talks about a figure called Ymir. That's Y-M-I-R. I'll see if I can just write that. Okay, Ymir, and it means twin. And in this creation myth, Ymir is torn apart by three other figures who he has kind of created. And his body, the body of Ymir, torn into pieces. One of these destroyers is Odin. The universe, the world, is created from the body parts of Ymir. There's a famous poem in the prose Edda, I think, that talks about of Ymir's flesh the world was made. The vault of the sky is his skull, and his blood forms the oceans, and his bones are the rocks. So there's an idea that the cosmos is anthropomorphic, and it comes through the destruction of a figure, and in this case it seems to be a male figure. And whether this is the case in all the myths is another question. But Bruce Lincoln, who has reconstructed the myths, talks of a primal figure called Twin, who is torn apart, and the world is created through the destruction of this twin. It's an androcentric, very male-oriented set of myths, and this goes along with what Lincoln believes to be a Bronze Age male-driven society. But my argument is actually that when you look at the myths in great detail, that you find a missing female element. So this is what Lincoln says in a 1975 paper that he wrote on the Indo-European creation myth, and this is what most Indo-European scholars use to argue that it's a male-driven mythology. He says we are led to reconstruct two myths, one European and one Indo-Iranian, both of which are quite similar and are closely related. In both of them, the world begins with a pair of twins, man and twin. That's Manu and Yemo. Yemo means twin. I think in French, Gémeaux is twin, so it's still the word is still the origin of some of our words. Gemini all come from Yemo, and this Norse Ymir also means twin. So Yemo being characterized as the first king, while Manu is the first priest. And in the course of the myth, Manu offers Yemo as the first sacrificial victim. As a result of this sacrifice, the world is created, and Manu fashions the earth and heavens, as well as the three social classes from his brother's body. So twin is a male twin, and there's two brothers, and the two brothers create the world. Now, in the Indo-Iranian version, an ox or bull, a male bovine, is offered along with Yemo, and from the body of this animal, all other animal and vegetable species are created. In the European version, however, a female bovine, a cow, appears and merely functions to feed and care for the twins prior to the act of creation. This is according to Lincoln, but we will see that there are other explanations for who this cow is. She isn't just she doesn't really merely function as a source of food. She has a more divine origin, I argue. So So these are the sources that Lincoln draws his Proto-Indo-European myth from. A number of old sort of Greek, old Russian sources, but then there's Roman sources like the myth of Romulus and Remus, mainly Indo-Iranian sources after that, and the Germanic side. The Ymir myth is a Germanic myth. But he goes into great detail into how he has reconstructed this form. Now, this is an illustration from the Edda, the Icelandic work by Snorri Sturluson, 13th century, I think. And this mentions this cow that merely is a source of food for the created twins, for man and twin, or in this Norse source, it's Ymir, the giant, and Odin, and Odin's two brothers who sacrifice Ymir. And here we can see this cow called Aldumla, which means noblest of cows. And you can see 4 rivers of milk pouring from her udders, and she's licking away the salt at the beginning of creation to form the frost giants. So is she just there as a kind of glorified picnic hamper, or is her role more vital than Lincoln suggests? So it helps actually if we start to think what the origin of this image might be. So Lincoln suggests the origin of this twin creation is from planting cultures. And when he says one could maintain that it is a myth found throughout the world whenever societies reach a certain stage of cultural development, specifically the tuber cultivating stage of the so-called paleoplanters. And the idea is that in order to grow vegetables, you have to cut up, say you're growing crops, you're growing cereal crops like wheat. So in order that for you to create new wheat, you need to cut up the old plant and bury it. So this is where the origin of this primal giant, who is killed at the start of time, buried, placed in the underworld, and then the crops grow from that. It's a kind of vegetal deity. So it's a vegetation myth in origin. There are hunter myths which talk about the divine sacrifice, but there's slightly different elements to it. So we won't go into those at the moment. So Mircea Eliade, the Romanian mythologist, also supports this plant origin. He says that the formation of the world from the body of a marine dragon or primordial giant seems to have developed in the culture of the earliest cultivators. And I think he's right. Now, this primal image appears in certain Hindu traditions where he is the first man, Purusha, and here's an image of Purusha. And just as Ymir forms a cosmos, so Purusha is at the origin of all creation. Now, in variants to this reconstructed Proto-Indo-European creation, there is the Near Eastern model. And in the Near Eastern model, we have the destruction of the primal parents who are united in some kind of original unity, and it's a male and a female, a brother and a sister, so twins. And these are rent apart in order to form the cosmos. Now, in certain Mesopotamian traditions, they tell of Marduk, who's this figure here, and his killing of the primordial dragon Tiamat. And Tiamat, it's the same word as you find in biblical creation myth that talks about the division of the waters at the start of creation. And those waters are called Tehom in the original Hebrew. And it's related to the same word as Tiamat. It means primordial waters. The dragon is the primordial unity of the waters which are split apart, and then one half becomes the waters of the earth, and the other becomes the waters of the sky, clouds or the heavens. This is from the Enuma Elish, which is the creation myth that is recorded from the Babylonian texts. And this tells of Marduk's killing of Tiamat and the creation of the heavens and the waters from her body. So in her belly he placed the heights of heaven. He laid down her, and then you get sort of bits of the text missing, head, heaped a mountain upon it, opened up such a spring that a torrent could be drawn off, then released through her eyes the Euphrates and Tigris, closed up her nostrils, reserved the water. He heaped up mountains at her udder, drilled fountains through the dugs to carry off the fountainhead. He went back to her tail, bound it to the great band, the Milky Way, that is, the Apsu beneath his foot, her crotch. He wedged up the heavens, so the sky was roof, the earth fixed. Now, this word here, Apsu, is the origin of our word abyss, and Apsu is the partner to Tiamat. Apsu is her husband, and they are united and pulled apart, so she becomes the Milky Way and the sky, and he becomes the underworld. So it's the same kind of idea that we find in the Indo-European myth suggested by Lincoln of the creation through the sacrifice of the divine being. Only in this case, the twin isn't a male twin who was killed by his brother, but it's a male and female twin who was separated to form the cosmos. And this is a cylinder seal from Babylon showing Marduk creating the world from the dragon. In Sumerian myth, we have the same image of a male and female pairing, which are split apart to make the world. So the world parents in Sumerian myth are Anshi and Kisha, and they form the cosmic mountain Anki, which is sitting in the watery void, and then that is split apart by the air god Enlil, Lord of the Storm. So that creates the earth and the heavens. So the air separates the sky and the ground. This is their concept of where the atmosphere comes from. So the sky appears. What separates the earth from the sky is our world, the atmosphere, the air we breathe. So the air separates the two, and this is something that is also found in Egyptian myth, as we will see. So here's the Egyptian counterpart. The Egyptian myth, there's a couple of Egyptian creation myths, but the one we're dealing with talks about the splitting of the sky from the earth. The earth is Geb. So here you can see Geb here. He's sometimes represented by a serpent. And he's in an embrace with his sister Nut. And here's Nut, sort of the overarching Nut. and the two are together in kind of sexual congress, and the air god Shu, who is actually their father in this case, comes between them and separates them, so that Geb falls away and forms the earth. So it's a male earth in this case, and then the sky is the goddess Nut, and the stars on her belly. So when you look up and you see the Milky Way, that is the form of Nut in the sky. So it's a division. Now, interestingly, she is also represented by the cow, by a white cow. If we think of Bruce Lincoln's recreation of the Proto-Indo-European myth, when he talks about the appearance of a cow, female cow, in especially the European mythologies, he says she's there merely to feed the twin. Whereas when we look at the Near Eastern examples, she is playing a vital role. The cow is there as the twin. She is the twin of the earth god. And this begs the question whether the Indo-European myths that Lincoln has reconstructed were originally this kind of myth, only they've become more androcentric, more male-oriented, as the culture has progressed through the Bronze Age and become more warlike, and has sort of shaken off some of its early Neolithic farming roots, which is my argument. So Nut is, as I have said, the Milky Way, and you can see a few depictions of her here. She's represented on the lids of coffins. That's on the image on the left. So the idea is that the dead, the soul of the dead, go into the Milky Way after death, and are reborn through her womb in the morning. Now the sun undergoes the same journey. The sun, which you can see at the throat of Nut on the left-hand side, also in the image at the bottom, you can see Nut stretched over the sky with a circular sun at her throat on the left-hand side. Now, at the end of the day, Nut, who is on the horizon as the Milky Way, swallows the sun. The sun then goes through her body and is reborn from her womb, having undergone a number of trials and battles through the night in the body of her, which is in the underworld, and then re-emerges the next morning on the eastern horizon as the newborn sun. So this is what will happen to the soul after death. You will be eaten by Nut and reborn through the body of the goddess. And there's some references here to this process in the pyramid text. May you go to those northern gods, the circumpolar stars. You, the sky goddess Nut, have taken to yourself every god who possesses his bark, that you may make stars of them in the starry sky. So the goddess is specifically and explicitly linked to the Milky Way, to cows, and to a rebirth in the stars. So with this in mind, we then look back at figures like Aldumla, the noblest of cows, and wonder whether she really is just a foodstuff, and whether she originally has a greater role as the sister of Ymir, as the twin sister. Now, one thing that supports this is looking at the Irish goddess Boann, or Boann, Boann, sometimes with a D on the end. It's actually pronounced Boine, so she becomes the River Boyne. She's the origin of the River Boyne, and the etymology of her name is Bo, which is cow, and fin, which is white. So she is the white cow. And she is involved in a creation myth that takes place at Newgrange, at the Great Burial Mound at Newgrange in County Meath. She gives her eye. She goes to a well belonging to her husband, to try and gain wisdom from the well in the same way that Odin does in Norse mythology. Now, Odin gives his eye in return for knowledge from the well. In the Irish myth, however, the waters of the well rise up magically when she tries to drink from them, and takes the eye out of her head. One of her arms and one of her legs are taken away in this sort of powerful flood, and she's in some versions she's drowned by the river, but in other versions she is the river Boyne. So the river Boyne, white cow, is this goddess. And a similar thing is found in Egyptian myth, where the waters of the Nile are associated with the cow goddess and are seen as the earthly reflection of the Milky Way in the sky, which is sometimes called the heavenly waterway or the heavenly Nile. So in Irish myth, this is Newgrange, just above the Boyne, and the Milky Way is called Boha Behuinia. I think that's how it's pronounced, which means the path or the road of the white cow. So again, the Milky Way in Irish myth has the same name as the River Boyne. So you have the waters above and the waters below. And we have a white cow associated with the Milky Way, with water and with rebirth, because this is Newgrange and this is where the bodies of the dead were placed for rebirth. So it's the coincidences between the Irish cow goddess and the Egyptian are so close. I got a chapter of this in my PhD where I talk about the exact parallels. There's too many to go into at the moment, and I'll probably go into them in the last lecture. But just to state that if you had to try and categorize Boyne as a type of goddess, you would say that she was much closer in nature to the Neolithic goddesses of Egypt than to the Proto-Indo-European cow that appears in Lincoln's reconstructions. And my reasoning would be that Lincoln's reconstruction is wrong, and that we are looking at a Neolithic origin in the Near East for this goddess. There is evidence of this cow link in other mythological figures in Irish myth. For instance, so Boan, Boyne, as I said, means white cow, but we also have a figure called Danu, who is related to her, and her name comes from the Proto-Indo-European Danu, which means she who gives milk. And we'll see that there's a Danu that appears in Indian sources as well, in Hindu sources. So she who gives milk is related to the one who produces liquid and water. And so it's no surprise that we find river names, just as Boyne is derived from this cow goddess. So river names in Europe, ancient river names, also derive from Danu. So the Don, for instance, the Dnieper, I don't know how to pronounce that, the Dnieper, and the Danube. So looking at the the Germanic and the Irish myths, it seems to be that these European examples seem to be closer to the Near Eastern pattern than the Proto-Indo-European of Lincoln. So what this did was make me want to look again at the Indo-Iranian myths, the sort of Eastern examples that he talks about, and see whether those also corresponded actually more to a male and female twin than had hitherto been credited. So I looked at the Indo-Iranian examples, the Hindu myths of Purusha, Yama. Yama means twin. He's a king of the dead, and an Iranian myth of Gaiamat. I'm not going to go into these in too much detail because it's all in the PhD and it's a bit long-winded. But I'm going to sort of go over it in summary. So Purusha, that's the cosmic man that I mentioned and showed the picture of at the beginning, is held up by Lincoln as an example of this male divinity that is ripped apart. He is a primal giant in the Rig Veda, which are these the earliest Hindu scriptures from sort of 12,000 BC. He is a primal giant in that he does create the universe from out of himself. Without a twin brother, however, where's the Manu figure that Lincoln says should be present? When the only other figure that does appear with him is actually a power called Viraj, and Viraj is really, when you look at it, a female energy. It's a female principle, and she is often depicted as a cow, and or linked with Prakti, which is a female creative energy. So again, this primal man that creates the cosmos. When you start to look at the origin of the sources, you realise that there's female cow energy involved somewhere in this. Same with the myth of Yama. Yama, twin, who is the god of the dead. He is actually killed by a figure called Manu, mentioned in the Rig Veda. But in this, Manu isn't his twin, he's his half-brother. So there is always someone like Marduk, who in the Mesopotamian myths, who is the one who, or Shu in the Egyptian, who is the slayer who splits the twins apart, but he's not the twin himself. He's sometimes a relation, a son, a father, and in this case, a brother-in-law. And in fact, Manu is connected to a twin sister who takes the form of a bull or cow. And again, the name Yama, twin. Where there's one twin, you expect another. And we do find in other verses of the Rig Veda a mention of a goddess called Yami, which is the female form of twin. So Yama and Yami are the original pairing, but the goddess, it's almost as if the goddess has been demoted or forgotten about, put to one side, probably over time as sort of the society becomes more androcentric. But this Yami is associated with cows and with a sacred river, the Yamuna River, which is a tributary of the Ganges, and milk is poured into the river in part of her worship. So here we have a female cow goddess associated with a milky river, and who is a twin to a creative god. The other main source that Lincoln uses for his Indo-Iranian man and twin and bull kind of creation myth is the Zoroastrian myth of Gaiamat, which talks about the dismembering of the bull or the ox. But again, Lincoln talks about this being a bull or an ox. It's a male animal, and it's just used to produce foodstuffs and metals and plants and the rest. But when you look at the origin of the name, the name Gavai Vedota, the first element, Gav, it's actually related to the Bov in Bovinda, which is the origin of the Irish word for cow, bow. It's a female cow. And we think that the original female cow was part of this creation myth, but due to certain taboos and restrictions in later Zoroastrianism, where the cow becomes sacred and it's illegal to kill a cow, this part of the killing of the cow is taken out of the myth. And so it's replaced by a bull. There was an original image, we think, of the dismemberment of the cow and sending up of its milk to form the Milky Way. So again, the Indo-Iranian sources from which Lincoln derives his information look very much actually to be based on the same kind of Near Eastern models that I talked of earlier, rather than being primarily an androcentric independent myth. Now, in his book on the Roman twins, Romulus and Remus, the scholar Wiseman talks about Lincoln's reconstructions and argues that Romulus and Remus, these famous male twins, are originally a man called Remus comes from Yemus, twin, and Romulus actually comes from Rumina, who is the goddess of ruminating, as in chewing, as in a cow goddess. So even these famous male twins are a male and a the female is associated with a cow. And he goes point by point through these different myths and shows how Lincoln's reconstruction just doesn't work. If there isn't a twin brother in any of these myths, the ice giant Ymir, in the first one we looked at in the Germanic sources, has no brother. He's killed by his kind of nephews, Odin. In other Germanic versions, he's the father of the being that kills him. Yama in India has a twin sister, and it just goes on and on. It just shows that Lincoln's reconstruction doesn't work. It is expressive of a later, perhaps Bronze Age or Iron Age situation where the goddess has been forgotten or pushed to one side. And this is important because scholars use his reconstruction to argue what Proto-Indo-European society was like. And if Proto-Indo-European society isn't the male-driven warrior culture that they've been trying to promulgate, then we have to ask ourselves, where did it originate? Was it in fact Neolithic and Near Eastern, as people like Colin Renfrew have suggested? And the mythology seems to be suggesting that it is. And the important point of this is also that if you start to reconstruct the myth differently, you come to different ideas of what the myth is about. Instead of it being about a sort of male creation and a first murder and using cow for foodstuffs, it becomes a cosmic myth on a grander scale involving a sky goddess who otherwise has disappeared from the myths, and it gives us a whole different slant on what Proto-Indo-European society would have been like. So what I've said is that the Ymir myth doesn't recount the murder of a twin by his twin brother, but a murder by a divine offspring produced from a female bovine associated with the origin of waters. It appears closer to Near Eastern cosmogonies than Lincoln's reconstruction suggests. And here at the bottom, I've got a bit there about Romulus and Remus, how the actual derivation of Romulus is from Ruma, the goddess who is associated with cows and who is worshipped by pouring milk into the Tiber. It's the same myth that we've found associated with Yami in the Hindu traditions. Now, when this all changed is a moot point, but Wendy Donegal O'Flaherty suggests that the earlier goddess worshipping cultures, there was a shift before even the Rig Veda was written, sort of 12,000 BC, 1200 BC, sorry. So she says, in studies of Indian mythology, the Rig Veda is usually taken as the beginning, but it would be misleading here to begin with the Vedas, for by the time they were being composed, circa 1200 BC, a major power shift had already taken place. In the earlier Indo-European period, there appears in myth and ritual an important goddess. She survives in the Rig Veda in the figures of Urvashi, Saranyu, and Yami, each appearing in a single obscure hymn. So even by this point, by the start of the Bronze Age, this older Neolithic, I would argue, goddess is being replaced in the myth. But there's enough pieces of evidence to suggest that she was originally there and that the form that she took was close to the Near Eastern myths that we've been looking at, the Egyptian and the Mesopotamian. So a close inspection of Indo-European myths has rendered Lincoln's reconstructed Proto-Indo-European cosmogony involving twin brothers obsolete. Instead, we are left with numerous examples by reinstated the female to her original role of a male and female, rich cow symbolism associated with rivers and the Milky Way, who together form the cosmos in a manner reminiscent of Near Eastern world parent cosmogonies, whose sundering from union result in the creation, release, and rebirth of the sun. Lincoln's male-oriented pastoral myths developed within a limited geographical area, the Indo-Iranian language zone, after the original female cow symbolism had been removed, transformed due to the power shift towards androcentrism. This is of extreme importance, for Lincoln's reconstruction must give way to one with direct and obvious parallels to Near Eastern models. Such Near Eastern analogues might be expected had the myths evolved in Anatolia or the Balkans amongst cattle-rearing farmers, as Renfrew posits, but equally may have come integrated into the Proto-Indo-European myth through borrowing neighbouring farming cultures, such as the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, before the main diaspora west into Europe and eastwards into Asia, which is the point that we made earlier. So to put it into diagrammatic form, if this analysis is placed into the dendrograph I mentioned earlier, we see that the initial spread of Lincoln's Proto-Indo-European myth does not reflect the facts. So this is the spread of this twin and man myth as posited by Lincoln. The red circles are showing where this myth seems to be apparent. These are the sources that he cites. If the examples fail to support his thesis, the ones we've just looked at, are removed, we find the androcentric forms he suggests as primary are now limited to the Indo-Iranian versions. And even here we find no evidence for Manu being the twin brother of Yemo. So this is where the male-oriented versions that he mainly draws on are now limited to. But even these don't have Manu as a twin brother, and there are shades here of earlier female figures. Instead, if the spread of the male and female cow motif is plotted, we find versions in both eastern and western branches, suggesting this form has the better claim to having been the Proto-Indo-European cosmogony, a hypothesis that suggests a much earlier date for Neolithic influence than Lincoln's model, and suggests Indo-European myth is a potential source of Neolithic symbolism for the scholar to mine. So this is the spread that we're left with. The orange are the versions where we can see traces of that earlier twin cow sister, but they've been sort of eradicated over time. And the red areas in Europe are those that show definite female cow symbolism, like the Irish boyne. And it's this map which really shows that the Proto-Indo-European myth is one that involves a cow goddess. So instead of Lincoln's man killing twin, which is only limited to this area now, we instead have the separation of the divine male and female parents by an intervening figure who is that sort of air shoe figure from Egyptian myth who separates the earth and the sky. So that's